Hello everyone and welcome to my van. This is the first time I'm broadcasting from the van. I am at a trailhead somewhere near the southern border and a four-wheel drive club just pulled up next to me and they are in, it looks like Mad Max. They're in every kind of vehicle imaginable and they're a bit loud, so bear with me. One of the most interesting things that's happened with being on YouTube here, this little foray into YouTube over the last 6 months, is that a lot of people have reached out asking a lot of good questions, and there have been a fair number of questions about how to do projects, long-term projects. That's a dog, someone's dog, by the way. Long-term projects. And I think that's a commendable, it's a commendable question. But I've had secondary questions that I think are more intriguing. One of which is people are asking for me to tell them what projects to do. And that's something I can't do because I'm not really sure who you are, where you live, etc. So for me to be here where I am now near the southern border and suggest a project may be completely unattainable for you. But it's an intriguing question. But I think before we get to the how to do projects, which I will get to in subsequent films, we have to talk about why to do projects. This is very important. So for whatever reason, when I started as a photographer, my immediate goal was to tell stories, but I was working in the newspaper field, and the newspaper field was the exact opposite of telling stories for the most part. You had to go and do assignments, and you had to encapsulate those entire stories into one image because the paper would often never run more than one. So I trained myself to do that, but as soon as I left the newspaper world, I began to tell stories with photographs and build what's called a photo essay or a photo story. And that's anywhere between 20 and 100 images, basically, built over time. So I'm not one of these people that travels to 20 different countries a year. I prefer to go to the same country 20 times and build a body of photographs. That's how I prefer to work. Again, not better or worse than any other way, just how I happen to like it. But what does doing a story do for me as a photographer? So the first thing it does is it broadens my skill set. When you start to put together bodies of photographs, you start to learn editing skills, you start to learn sequencing skills, and you start to learn design skills, because ultimately you always want to end up in publication, and that tends to become the third part of the equation where you get better at editing, you get better at sequencing, and then you go, I really want to see how this looks in print kind of thing. So shooting random photographs, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. What tends to happen with random photographs is you end up with more of a portfolio style body of work, which is, look at how amazing I am. I've shot these 10 random images, but they may or may not tell a story at all. And when you go to telling photo essays, you have to begin to make photographs that aren't necessarily aesthetically pleasing, but they give the reader information to keep them going on the story, or they gives them an understanding of what you're trying to get across. Editing skills are essential regardless of whether or not you're shooting random images or you're shooting a photo essay. And what often gets overlooked is sequencing. And sequencing is a very specific skill that often gets overlooked in the process of putting together a photo essay. And basically what that means is what image goes first to what image goes last. And I always equate this to a roller coaster. I hate roller coasters. I don't like speed and I don't like heights. But yet I still go on these things for reasons I can't explain. So when you get on a roller coaster, often they don't hit you with the killer drop right off the bat. They antagonize you first, and they put you on that long, slow climb where the tracks are clicking. And that whole time up there, I questioned my own decision-making and asked myself why I'm on a roller coaster again. And then they hit you with the killer drop. And I think that's a good rule of to follow when you're actually sequencing a body of work, is to take that reader on an arc and the story arc. And remember, attention spans today are very different than they were 10 years ago, so you have to edit and sequence very smartly, very concisely to make sure you're getting your message across. Okay, so let's talk about why you do photo projects from another angle. And I'm stealing this from a friend of mine who I used to teach with from time to time, who is what I would call a book publishing photography expert. And he's also just an amazing down-to-earth guy. And so we used to teach, and at one point he was talking about photo books, and I would talk about the self-publishing world, and he would talk about the traditionally published world. And he always broke things into two categories, which was an author-driven book or a story-driven book. And I want to steal that concept and apply it to photography. You can have an author-driven project, or you can have a story-driven project. Author-driven projects are created to showcase and highlight how talented the photographer is. So, for example, I go do a story on the southern border, and I make this, and the whole thing is about me, and I go, look how amazing I am as a photographer. What gets lost is the story I'm telling. And what gets brought to the center is my skills as a photographer. Now, the downside of that is that the market for those projects are tiny, because the only people who care about my skill as a photographer tend to be other photographers. So those in the photo book world, author-driven books tend not to sell very well, no matter how famous the photographer is. They are printed and they sell in very small quantities. But here's where things get interesting. The story-driven project. And the story-driven project elevates the concept and the story that you're trying to tell, and your skill as a photographer is secondary. This is what I prefer to work on. I'm 51 years old. Do I need to tell people I'm a good photographer? No, and nobody cares. My family doesn't care. I don't think my family's ever even asked me ever about my photography in 28, 30 years of doing this. Whatever, doesn't matter. So what I prefer to do is find a story I find intriguing that I think you might find intriguing, and then I use my skill as a photographer to tell that. And I think for the vast majority of you, story-driven projects is where you're going to have the most fun in the long run, because it is really rewarding to be able to open someone's mind about a project or a story or a concept that they may not know. For example, this zine that I'm doing with Beyond Clothing, AG23, the entire goal of the project was to educate and illuminate through art and design. We wanted to print and run stories that, yes, they were done by talented creatives, but really the story is the message of what each of these projects is about. Like my piece in the zine was about the game of Go. So yes, I made the photographs, but it has nothing to do with me behind the camera. It has everything to do with me wanting you to understand what happened in 2012 with the game of Go. So for most of you out there, when you're asking about what projects to do, how to do them, my first thought is, you've got to figure out why you want to tell a story, and then you have to figure out what story it is you want to tell. And then you can move forward from there. The world is flooded with images. It's really hard to get any attention with a portfolio these days. I looked at portfolios last week. Every single one of them was solid. Literally every single one. It was hard to differentiate from person to person. A lot of the work looked the same, but it was exposed correctly. It was framed correctly. There were peak action moments. Everything was good. But I can't remember individual portfolios now when I look back on it, because they all kind of blended together. What I didn't see was a lot of great stories. And so finding a great story, I would look for something personal, something that's close to you, and something that you can get time and access on. Those are the two things when you're doing a story that you really can't get around, are time and access. The more you have of each, the better your story is going to be. The less you have, you're going to be limited. So I hope that helps in terms of making you think about why you would do this before you figure out how you would do this. And I'll be back soon with a little information about the how. Thanks for tuning in.